Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Zooming In, Macro Photography 101, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks for the introduction and welcome everyone. I'm excited to chat with you about macro photography and really just kind of introducing you to some of the places that you don't get to experience just walking in the woods. You kind of have to see them through the camera. And for me, that's a really exciting place to be able to spend my time with photography because it gives you shots like this that just make me ask a lot of questions like what's going on here, what am I looking at, what is that plant? And for me, that's the whole process of photography is really getting you thinking about the world around you and asking questions and being curious. So I'll share some little anecdotes throughout this presentation. We'll go through a library of photos that I've collected all around the world, and with a focus on macro photography. Uh, and at the end, please save your questions. For the purposes of the webinar, I'll kind of keep this at an introductory level of looking at macro photography for folks that are interested in getting into it. And then at the end, we can dive into more specific details because I'm guessing that there are some folks on this webinar who have quite a bit of experience in macro photography, and hopefully some of the tips that I share today will put in another tool in your quiver. So my photography right now is really centered around northern peatlands. So these are ecosystems that are wetland ecosystems that store an unbelievable amount of carbon. So they have a huge role to play in addressing climate change. And they also are home to unique species. So as we're faced with another mass extinction, global extinction event, we're looking to places like peatlands to try and protect them, to try and slow down the loss of species, because these places are home to plants and animals that can't live anywhere else. And so my body of work around these areas is it's called the Northern Peatlands Project, and I'm trying to share images that inspire people to learn more about these places and also hopefully restore and protect them. And you can get a monthly newsletter from me by scanning this QR code or going to twoline.com/tracks. And so this is the work that I'm doing in addition to taking on client work in the realm of outdoor marketing as well as land conservation. And then 4 times a year, I get the incredible opportunity to guide with Natural Habitat Adventures. And so today, we're just going to focus on one little aspect of that guiding that I do, which is sharing photography with people. So even on trips that are not geared around learning how to take pictures, a lot of people are really curious about being able to use their phones to take better pictures too. And so it's really fun for me to try and teach people new skills so they can try and take different types of pictures, because we all are equipped with if you have a smartphone, you have an incredible camera in your pocket. The camera that I started on in my career is probably not as good as a lot of the latest smartphones. And so we're just in this time where everyone has access to cameras. And so everyone has the opportunity to learn a lot about them. And the images that we're looking at here, I'm actually starting in kind of an abstract place for macro photography. These are actually digital scans of leaves that I've then just done a small amount of touch up on. And for a while in college, when I was taking photography classes, I got kind of obsessed with leaf patterns. And so I was scanning all these leaves in, and I'm somebody who really loves crisp detail in my photos. And so that's something that draws me towards macro photography, because macro photography is all about uh, taking really small worlds and making them large and trying to reveal hidden details. And so this was kind of a version of that. Some people will define macro photography in different ways. But for me, that'll be the definition that we use today, is just trying to reveal hidden worlds to make things seem larger than they are in real life. And so this project was kind of the point at which I realized that I was really excited about trying to play with scale and trying to make small things really big on print or on the screen. And so I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so that I can share a different screen to go into the portfolio. And I found that sometimes it's nice to share. Just give me a second here to toggle over. There it goes. Share this screen. All right. Looks like that's coming through okay. So I wanted to share using this preview window because for all those camera geeks out there that are interested in the stats behind each photo, they're going to show up on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'll point those out as we go through. Remember, these images, this first collection that we're looking at, these are all digital scans. So I was taking the physical leaf, putting it on the scanner bed, a really high-resolution scanner. And the thing that I came across that was a little bit challenging for producing these images on a large scale is that leaves have a really waxy surface. And that waxy surface actually serves a function. It helps them trap moisture so that they don't lose moisture through the process of evapotranspiration. And for me, for my purposes in photography, it created a challenge because the waxy surface made it seem as if it wasn't really clear. And so a lot of my editing that I did was going in and finding the right contrast level that would make it look like a more clear image, even though it was fantastically clear. And something that I found is that the texture of leaves that were further along the process of decomposition actually had more clarity. And looking at these leaves up close, all of these are basically like a 1 inch by 1 inch physical leaf that we're blowing up here to however large your screen is. And to me, the more dead the leaf was, the more interesting it was to be able to look at the different patterns. And obviously, the phenomena that we're looking at here is that plants, photosynthetic plants have chloroplast, which is the organelle responsible for converting, uh, carbon dioxide and sunlight through this chemical process into sugars that they can eat and the byproduct of oxygen. And as fall comes around, those leaves die and they lose that chloroplast that's responsible for reflecting green. And as the chloroplasts die back, we're starting to see all the different wavelengths that are emitted by these leaves. And so for me, that was just a really fun project that I was working on in an independent study. This was probably 15 years ago. And so that kind of launched me into getting really excited about macro photography. And it made me want to start to play with that through a camera lens. And so just to give you a quick guide, this might be very small on your screen, but I'll try and call out some stats as we go. You'll find the focal length over here. This image was taken with a 50 millimeter. Exposure was 1/640th of a second, and ISO 400, and the f-stop 1.4. So with macro photography, often what I'm trying to do is create a really shallow depth of field. And to be able to do that, you want to have an f-stop that's wide open, or in other words, a small number. So f-stop usually goes from like 1.4 all the way up to f22. And so for me in macro photography, the starting place is usually around 1.4, 1.8, 2.8, somewhere in that realm, unless I'm trying to do something different with the composition. So here you're starting to see those water droplets sitting on top of those oak leaves and creating some nice contrast with the pine needles on the ground. And this perspective is another big thing to think about as you're approaching macro photography. I find that the two most successful angles that you want to use are straight down, looking straight down at the ground, feels pretty natural in terms of when you look at an image, you can understand it fairly well. And then also just getting on the level of your subject. So often laying on the ground, trying to get your subject in view and on the same level as what you're trying to take a picture of. But macro photography, I think sometimes when we hear the words, we're often thinking about bugs, like making bugs really big and crystal clear. And often for me, right now there's this movement towards super micro photography, which is using effectively a microscope to be able to take images. And one of the trends in macro photography is to stack images. So as I was saying, macro photography, often you're using a wide open aperture, which creates a shallow depth of fields. Only one item is in focus in the whole picture. Here, the edge of the leaves is in focus, and then the background is blurred. In focus stacking, you take a series of images, often between 20 and 200 images, and you're changing the focus point from 1 meter away from the camera, 1.1 meter away from the camera, 1.2. So you're just slowly taking each picture, moving the focus, taking each picture, moving the focus. And that used to be a manual process. You used to have to do that all manually. And then in post-processing, you had to go through this very rigorous process to be able to stack the images and combine all the in-focus parts from the different images to create something really crisp and clean and everything's in focus. That to me it takes a long time, and I have a ton of respect for the people that do it, but it's almost like a different art form. For me, I'm much more drawn to trying to do a single capture, trying to play with how much of the image is in focus to give the feeling that you're looking for. And this series of 4 images shows you all the ways that you can change the feel of the moment. So I'll emphasize a couple things. The distance you are from the subject is going to change how much is in focus. So if you keep all of your settings on the camera the same and you are 6 inches away from your subject, only the subject is going to be in focus, nothing else will be. But then if you keep all the settings the same and move 4 feet away from your subject, there's going to be a wider swath that's in focus. And old cameras, back when it was analog and film, they would actually show you on the focus ring the distance from the camera that would be in focus. And you can look that up, and there are different ways to get those settings to show up. But in this series of 4, you can tell like this is all the same 2 leaves that I'm floating through between these 4 images. But I'm changing the position of the camera in relation to the sun. I'm changing the focus, I'm changing the aperture, and also the shutter speed. So on this image, it's f22, which is a really, really small opening to get a little bit of lens flare on the sun as it meets the edge of the leaf. And then an ISO of 500 because I'm hand holding this shot, and the exposure is pretty slow relatively for hand holding at a 70 millimeter lens at 1/60. Whereas on this shot, I'm using f2.8. So all of a sudden we went from a really tiny opening to a really large opening, and large being a small number, it's very confusing. But f2.8, and we created this bokeh effect. So it's in focus leaves, completely out of focus background. I've also gotten a lot closer to the subject. And as you can see, I'm still using a 70 millimeter focal length. And to compensate for all that, the shutter speed went to 1/1000. And then here back to somewhere in the middle, f16. I'm a little bit closer than in this shot. Oh no, I'm about the same distance away. But I've opened up the focal length to 24 meters instead of this one being 70 meters. So the longer lens length is going to compress your field of view and change what's in the image and how the image feels. And then this last one was just playing with where the camera is in relation to the sun. So all of these are backlit. The sun is on the other side of my subject, this branch and these two leaves. But I put the sun right at the top of the image to create kind of this washed out feel. And to be honest, I'm not sure which of the four of these I prefer, but I really like all four of them. But my true passion in macro photography is trying to get some really charismatic shots of wildlife. So this is a painted turtle, Chrysemys picta, and this was actually taken with a Canon. So this is the first digital SLR that I ever used, the Canon EOS 5D Mark II. It was with a 100 millimeter macro that goes down to a 2.8 f. And so it's a fixed length lens, which often results in much crisper, sharper images. In this instance, I was using f4, and the exposure time was 1/1250. This is a highly underexposed image because I wanted it to look like this turtle is just floating in the air. I didn't want to be able to see any of the water because this turtle is in the water. It's pretty brackish water. It's tannin stained, so it's really brown, a dark water, and that allowed me to kind of create this effect where it felt like that turtle was floating. And there was no lighting used. This is just natural light. Almost all of my photography tries to use natural light, mostly because I'm a little bit lazy. I really don't like setting up flash, and it's another art form. You really have to do it well to be able to create the effect you're looking for. So here's another image, wide open aperture, trying to keep the focus in the middle of the frame, kind of at a diagonal from the middle left down to the bottom right. And I was trying to, in an image like this, where your subject, if you will, is just lily pads, I'm trying to create a composition, because this was a big field of lily pads. I'm trying to create a composition that's pleasing just based on the colors of the different leaves. So this is another angle of that same patch. And here, completely changing the angle of which that I'm taking the picture. So here I'm a little bit more removed, and I'm also underexposing this image again, so that I can get that really dark water and get your eye really drawn to that flower. It's once again just looking at a really wide open aperture, and I took a bunch of images of this leaf. One of the things you'll have to play with when you're using a wide open aperture is where you put the focus. So I always select pinpoint focus, and then I use my thumb, I'll show you, on this tracking ring. So this is a Nikon Z8. Sorry, this is the Z6. The Z8 is over there. But I use this tracking ring to quickly move around the focus, which will be in a red box when the camera's on, to be able to see which part I want in focus, and then press down halfway to lock it in, and then potentially reframe the photo. But the different compositions of this photo really were just playing with where I was placing that focus to get to make sure that because wherever the sharpest pixels are, wherever the thing is in focus, that's where your eye is going to be drawn to. And so for me, I don't love doing a lot of post editing. Sometimes you can adjust where the focus is. For instance, some people on this image, on the lower left-hand side of the image, they would blur that out in post. But I really like to try and do as much in-camera work as possible and just kind of keep it that way. And so for me, it's just playing around with my position and where I'm placing the focus on my subject. This is a shot that I'm happy with, but I wish it was a little bit different. I feel like what I want is for more of them, all of the mushrooms to be in focus. So if I were to go back to this image in the field, if I were to have a moment with these mushrooms again, I would probably open up that f-stop from 2.8 all the way up to like f11 and see if I could get all of those mushrooms in focus without putting any of the background objects in focus. But at the end of the day, I might come back to it and say that I still prefer this shot. Here's another example of being intentional about where you put your focus. So I focused pretty much just a little bit off center on this one. And I remember I took a few different shots of this composition with different exposures. And I was happiest with this one because your eye is drawn to those fronds that are running up and down in the center of the image. But then just the feeling that you're moving through these fern tunnels is fun. And you're seeing, once again, a lot of my shots, you're either seeing straight down or you're looking at the subject from the side. You can kind of think about it in terms of how we photograph people. Like, you don't want to be looking down at someone or looking up at someone unless you're trying to create like a superhero pose. So often I'm thinking about in the same way with these tiny subjects on the ground. Here, a lot of people, when they take pictures of flowers, they want more to be in focus, but I kind of like using flowers as almost like a way to paint with color. So I love having a really shallow depth of field. This is still with the Canon 5D Mark II. And these photos were taken like in 2013. Once again, just trying to think about a color palette. I like how these images together, those are it's a flower and a sagebrush that you find together often, and the color palettes are really pleasing. Equisetum, once again, you're seeing that the focus really needed to be on the very tip of that plant to be a pleasing composition. Thinking about the rule of thirds, trying to put that focus point in those areas where if you were to divide the image vertically into thirds and horizontally into thirds, the pinpoint box, those are the areas where you'd want to try and put your subject. And here I break the rules immediately by putting it dead center, but I just liked how it made such a calm image to have it, the sagebrush frond just surrounded by the color palette of the rest of the sage. And this really highlights one of my favorite things about this plant, which is it's highly adapted to an arid environment. So it has what's called pubescence, these little tiny hairs on the surface of the leaf. And that actually increases the boundary area between the leaf and the air so that it prevents it from heating up in the sun. So it just breaks up the boundary layer so that if that leaf is able to maintain a cooler temperature, it's actually able to hold on to water when it opens up the small openings in the leaf structure called stomata. It needs to open those up to let in gas exchange and to take in carbon dioxide, to let out oxygen, but it regulates the opening and closing of those areas. And if the difference in the temperature between the leaf and the air is really extreme, you're going to lose more moisture. So whenever you see pubescence on plants, it's a good indication that they're trying to hold on to their moisture through that mechanism, as well as by preventing herbivory, because anytime you have hairy structure on plants, it's a barrier for those herbivores, those insects, to be able to eat those leaves. So we could spend a whole lot of time on every one of these pictures, just kind of diving into the ecology behind each of the stories. But this is another example, super wide open aperture, so f-stop of 2.8, exposure time of 1/125, which that introduced a small amount of motion because I was hand holding the camera. And the general rule of thumb for exposure time is you want to have the number 1 over the length of your lens. So in this instance, I was using a 100mm lens. So at the very, very light end, you'd want 1/100. Ideally, you want double the number of the lens, so 1/200. So I was kind of breaking the rules here, but I like what happened because it created some motion in the image and kind of softened it up. So this is kind of I'm breaking my own rules of wanting really sharp pixels by having some motion in the image itself. Here's just a magnificent image of a dragonfly. And I really love in this image how I'm shooting through grass. And so you can see these kind of horizontal diagonal lines crisscrossing the image. But even though those are there, the eyeball of the dragonfly is incredibly sharp. And this next shot, I get closer to the dragonfly. And part of the advantage of a dedicated macro lens like this one, this is a 105mm macro from Nikon. And you can get, so this is the end of the lens, and I can put my subject right here and be able to focus. So every lens has a minimum focusing distance. And that's usually what designates a macro lens, is if you can get the subject really close to the edge of the camera lens, that would mean you can use it for macro photography. This lens is like my second favorite lens to use, and this is actually a super wide angle 20mm 1.8s lens from Nikon. And the reason why I like this for macro photography is because you can get incredibly close to your subject with this lens. I have some examples later that I'll show that I took with this one. But here we're using 100mm, so you're really trying to blow up, make things appear larger than they are. One of the things I love about this image, where my cursor is, if you can see that, that's called a spiracle. It's a hole in the wall of the abdomen of the insect, and that allows for gas exchange. So that's how they breathe, is actually through those holes. Another example of being intentional about focus. So I was trying to get that water droplet in the center left of the image perfectly in focus. And then there's kind of this horizontal line of focus that goes across. So I was really happy with that image. But once again, here the f-stop, I made it a little bit smaller so that more was in focus. But it's that 100mm macro lens from Canon on the 5D Mark II. And here I'm following the rules. 1/250 for exposure time on a 100mm lens with ISO of 400. I was hand holding at this one. Here's the side of a brook trout in spawning colors, and I'd love to do this one again. I wish that I could be further away from the subject and make more things in focus, because right now, because of the texture of the fish, there's like a meniscus over the top of their skin, just this gooey liquid that makes it hard to look like you're getting a super crisp shot. So I would love to go back, and I had wiggle room because the exposure time here is 1/1250. So this was just me rushing to put this fish back in the water. because so I didn't get my settings perfect. And you're looking at, I could have bumped the ISO down to get a better image quality. I could have gone with a slower exposure time, and then I could have closed down the f-stop to try and get more of the fish in focus. So if I were to take this one again, those are a few of the things I would do. I really love um, photographing ice. Like, it's just a really fun thing to photograph, and especially the formations that you get on rivers in the winter and in really cold days. Here you're getting an exposure time of 1/50 on that 100 millimeter lens, uh, and the f-stop is f11. So some of the blurring that you're seeing is actually movement of the water that's causing a blur. So playing with all of the different variables gives you a lot of different options for how you can take a picture. And this is just a dew droplet on this really cool moss that was on the edge of a hot spring in Grand Teton National Park. This is a feather amongst an algal mat on the edge of Grand Prismatic Spring. You'll see some really amazing artifacts, remains of animals left behind. And I just love this shot because it's kind of this contrast between the feather and then this algae that lives only at that particular climate band. And then another thing that I love to do is when taking pictures of especially things that are really heavily patterned is to take away some of the color that you see, because sometimes that's distracting from the texture of the actual thing that you're trying to photograph. I'll show you, this is a picture of the same leaf with color, and it's pretty and I like it, but somehow it doesn't quite have the impact that this photo does. Like, it just makes you focus on one aspect of what you're looking at, which is the texture of the edge of the new leaf. This is a brand new leaf that had just formed. And then also the texture of all the patterns of the vasculature within the leaf surface itself. This is an aspen leaf, and one of my favorite things about aspen is that, we call them quaking aspen, and their leaves are very susceptible to quaking in the wind, to rattling in the wind. And this is actually an adaptation to try and hold on to water. So it's breaking down that boundary layer and trying to self-regulate their temperature. And that's actually caused by the way that the blade of the leaf meets what's called the petiole, the little stem that comes off the leaf. If you were to feel the blade of the stem, the petiole, you'd see that it's flattened out and perpendicular to the leaf, and aerodynamically that just causes the leaf to flutter even in really light wind. This is one of my favorite macro shots. This is actually the dorsal fin of a grayling fish underwater, and the next shot is what happens to that same exact fin when it's pulled out of the water. So underwater, you have all these amazing iridescent reflections. It's green and blue and red. And you pull it out of water and it just completely loses its life. It's just this kind of red and yellow, almost reminiscent of feathers. But this fish was only 6 inches long, and the sail itself is maybe the biggest part of the fish, but 4 inches long, maybe 2 inches wide. And so here, the exposure time, I wish that I had gone faster, but this is a really dark image because it was the camera was out of the water, but the fish was just barely underwater. I was holding the fish and the camera at the same time to try and get this shot. And so a lot of things that I'd love to do different there, but kind of a unique situation that you don't see too often because it's a pretty rare fish to catch. I'll just kind of cruise through these flower pictures. Just for me, when I'm doing macro photography, when I put that lens on and I'm trying to go and take a bunch of pictures, I'm taking a bunch of different iterations, changing the focus, changing the different settings, my distance from the subject, to be able to play with, to figure out which thing I like the most. And so I think that's just photography in general, is just being playful and trying to figure out how you can approach each subject. This is a boreal toad, which I always get really excited about because they're fairly rare and threatened. For me, every time you start photographing animals up close, it's unbelievably important that the eyeball is crisp, super, super clear. And there's a lot of technology now in cameras that helps to make sure that that happens every time. Before, you'd have to be really agile with your thumb on the control pad for the focus. You'd jump it around to find the eye, lock it in, and take the picture. Now you can create a setting where you're just using a box, and if the eye is inside that box, it locks on automatically, and the software is absolutely amazing. So the game is changing rapidly. One of the things I haven't mentioned is, I personally, for my definition of macro photography, is focusing on the details, making small things larger than life. I wouldn't necessarily say that this shot is not macro photography, but to me, it's kind of in the same vein. But I would never shy away from using a long lens, even up to something like this, a 400 millimeter, to do another type of composition with a subject up close. So if I'm trying to photograph a salamander that I'm really excited about, I'll try every lens in my quiver to figure out which one is going to create my favorite composition or give the best quality. Even that shot was just shot with a 50 millimeter of kelp, of seaweed. Here we're getting a couple photos from Iceland. This is not, I don't think this is this exact lens. It is saying it's the 20 millimeter 1.8. But that's one of my favorite lenses to use for getting your subject bigger than life and then also showing the context of where that subject is. I'll have some more examples of that coming up. And also, just for me, the macro photography is especially powerful when you pair it with a shot that's really expansive. So I love to play with scale, especially in my work on northern peatlands. I'm always kind of zooming out to an aerial perspective that's 400 feet off the ground and captures miles of land underneath, and then zooming into the tiniest thing to be able to share some similarities between the large and macro scale. Here are some of those classic bug photos that you would expect to see in a macro photography conversation. There are some truly spectacular images being taken right now and manipulated through image stacking, what we were talking about earlier. These images are just single exposure, mostly because I'm lazy and don't want to deal with the post-processing. But this bug in particular is one of my favorites. It's a dogbane beetle, and they usually come out about around the 4th of July, and they're colored for it. And they're feeding on dogbane, which is in the milkweed family. Right here, he's got a little bubble that he's feeding on. But it's really dangerous for them to feed on this plant because, similar to milkweed, they produce a latex. And that latex can gum up the mouth parts of the bugs and make it so they can't feed anymore. And so they have to very carefully release pressure of the leaves, let it drain, and then feed more. And so I just love watching and photographing these bugs. And here's another bug that also feeds on milkweed. And here's taking a big drink of that latex solution. It's just amazing that they can even survive on that. And they'll exclusively feed on that plant. Here it's Darlingtonia, which is a carnivorous plant out in California, and Darlingtonia State Park is where these pictures were taken. It's just this tiny boardwalk that goes out into this field of carnivorous plants. Really magical. And here is, we've made our way back to where I'm calling in from in Adirondack Park. And this is shot with the 105 millimeter macro. That's my current favorite macro lens. And this was a pretty dark day. So the ISO was at 500 to try and allow me to continue to hand hold this shot, because I don't love using a tripod because it feels like I'm limited in how many compositions I can do. I will use it in certain really low light conditions, but cameras now have such good low light capabilities that you're freed up to do a lot more by hand. So this is the pitcher plant, also a carnivorous plant that you find here, and has this nectar in the base of that cup that draws insects and snails, small animals, into the cup. They drink from the nectar, and that's toxic, and so they start to become drunk and fall into the fluid, which is actually a digestive enzyme that the plant uses to break down the nutrients of their prey. So pretty amazing. These down-facing hairs on the surface that you can see here up on the top surface of the leaf, those actually help. They're down-facing. So insects can crawl down them, but once they get inside, it's much harder to crawl back out. Just another image of bog rosemary surrounding this plant that I can't seem to identify, this pink one. I think it's a young version of another plant that's very common in the bog, but I haven't been able to confirm. And that's a close-up of the water droplets on there. To me, this is the magic of macro photography. You can just, walking in the bog, unless I really laid down and looked closely, I just don't think I could have experienced this. And being able to capture something like that with your camera is pretty fun. And here's an example of an image that I'm still not crazy about, because all the plants are at different levels and only the bottom layer is in focus. And so those plants on the top are out of focus. On one hand, it gives good depth to the image. Like, you feel like you're looking through the plants to get to the bottom. But there's something about this that I haven't figured out why I don't like it. And maybe it's just adding a bit more of a vignette around the outside, a really soft vignette that you wouldn't notice too much, but I just feel like my eye doesn't know where to rest. But at the same time, it's just really interesting look at sphagnum moss, which is that red and yellow plant on the carpeting the floor of the peatland. And now we're getting a really close up of the sphagnum moss. So using the same lens as in this photo, the 105 millimeter, but just getting super close, and same f-stop, roughly the same exposure time. I'm just looking at the right-hand side of the panel here. But I'm underexposing a little bit, because the yellow, if there's a lot of bright colors in an image, it can cause the camera to overexpose. So I usually knock it back a little bit. So maybe I'll be an aperture priority, but I'll set the exposure to be a couple stops underexposed when I'm photographing a scene like this. And just another composition of that sphagnum moss. This moss is one of the primary contributors to the accumulation of peat in peatlands. So they cover most of the surface of the peatland. They can store up to 40% of their weight in water, 40 times of their weight can be stored in water. So they just have an unbelievable amount of water reserves, and they help keep water in an ecosystem, and they can help with storm surge. So upstream peatlands can make sure that downstream houses don't get flooded. I just love the ability to see the textures of plants when you're really up close like this with this fern. And once again, just getting pinpoint sharp focus on eyeballs anytime you're photographing subjects like a snake. And here's that image that I was talking about earlier using that 20 millimeter lens and getting really close. You know, this lens was almost touching the top of those pitcher plants. And I'm looking almost exactly down, directly down on this little cluster of plants here. And that's actually an image showing a couple insects in the fluid inside that pitcher plant. Here's sphagnum moss as we go into the winter, and it starts to create a frost covering over the outside of the sphagnum. That's actually something that they'll do. They'll push moisture out of their cell walls out onto the surface so that it forms frost in the early season, and that actually creates this insulative layer, and it prevents the ice from puncturing their cells if they were to keep it inside. So now this is just for scale, this image, but now I'm going to break my rules because these images are taken with flash on the big night migration of salamanders that we have here, where thousands of salamanders will cross from upland woodlands down into their vernal pools where they will mate, lay their eggs. And it's this huge migration that happens on the first warm and rainy evening in the spring. So I go out with headlamp and reflective gear and help salamanders cross the road and take their photo as they go. And these critters are just unbelievably charismatic. And so for this, you're actually seeing in the reflection of the eye, right where my cursor is, you're actually seeing the hood that I'm using over the top of my macro lens that helps create a soft diffusion light. So I'm taking just a speed light and then this big custom hood that helps diffuse the light and create more of an even lighting scenario so that it's not so harsh. But the one thing I did encounter with that is that I was getting some of those reflection spots that I'm not crazy about. So I'm still trying to navigate how do I create a picture at night with flash that doesn't look like it. So if anyone has any tips, send me an email. So we're just about getting to the end here of these images, but the general idea is, for me with macro photography, it's uncovering worlds, it's being playful. There are no rules of what macro photography is or isn't in my book, and just trying to play with all the variables that are available to create different compositions, different effects, and try and bring back some of that wonder that we have for the natural world. So with that, I'm going to end sharing here, and then we'll open up for questions for the last couple minutes.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Now, before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, so let's dive into some of these questions. So what is the deal with macro tubes? What are they, and are they necessary?
All right, so I think I know what you're talking about. But so let's look at it this way. Every lens has a specified distance from the end of the lens to the subject, at which point they can start to focus. Most lenses, that's going to be at least 2 meters, maybe more. A macro lens is specifically built so that you can focus right here on the end of the lens. Macro tubes are a way to convert a normal lens that typically focuses at 3 meters into a macro lens. And what it does, in similar way to like going back to like physics, right? In eighth grade physics, but thinking about lenses and the distance that you are. Anyway, the point is, if you extend the distance between a normal lens and the camera with what's called a macro tube, you are converting this lens into a macro lens. So with the tube in there, suddenly you can focus much, much closer to the camera. But the problem with those is that they're not going to have quite, they do a great job. And if you're interested in trying it, you should absolutely do it. They're very inexpensive for what they are. But they're not going to be the same quality as if you buy a dedicated macro lens. Great question.
Great, thanks for tackling that one. So one of our guests asks when they turn their digital camera to underexpose a picture, um, what does the camera adjust? What causes it to underexpose?
All right. So on this particular camera, it's a Nikon. If I'm in, on this camera, aperture priority is selected with this dial up here. So you go into A. Now with my dial here, I'm adjusting for the f-stop, and then shutter speed is automatically being selected by the camera's software to create a perfect exposure. Sometimes your camera is reading that perfect exposure wrong because you're shooting snow or you're shooting a white, a predominantly bright colored mountain with a lot of glare. So then you're going to come into this button here, the plus minus, and you're going to use the wheel to be able to drop it down a couple notches. And what that does is it tells the camera, hey, I want you to underexpose by either one stop or two stops. The other way to underexpose is just shoot in fully manual, and then you're using that little dial that it'll tell you the camera is not exposed perfectly or overexposed or on. And instead of putting the little tick mark right in the center at 0, you're going to move towards the negative side, which means you're underexposing. But if you Google, how do I underexpose using aperture priority on, insert your camera model here, it'll come up with all kinds of tutorials of how to do that.
Great, thanks for the advice, Charlie. So on your Four Leaves project, did you change lenses?
On the Four Leaves project, that's right. That one, I remember, I'd have to pull them up, but I think on that one it was all a 70 millimeter. So I was just moving myself further and closer to the subject and changing the aperture to be able to create those different effects. And that one I was backlighting the subject, so the sun was out, the sun was here, the subject was here, and I was here, and I was playing with where the camera was, really small movements to be able to put the sun in a different position relative to the subject. And that's really what was predominantly creating those effects.
All right, great, thank you. So have you ever done macro of bees that are moving on flowers? Any insights on shutter speed versus other settings?
Yeah, the equivalent. So I guide the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacán, Mexico, and that trip there's so much monarch butterfly photography, and the rule of thumb for a flying monarch butterfly is at least 1/1,000. So you can kind of use, but really it just comes down to every lighting scenario is going to be different. When you're in bright sunlight, you can just bump the shutter speed way up to just as high as you want. But if you're in low light, that's when you get into a little bit more of a tricky scenario. And it depends on how fast the subject is moving, and if you're trying to, if it's a flying bee while it's hovering, like if you want the wings to be frozen, that's going to be like 1/3,000. It's going to be incredibly fast shutter speed. So it really, I hate to give it it depends answer, but in this instance, it definitely depends.
All right, thank you, Charlie. So Do you offer any online macro tutorials, or do you know of any place where I could learn more information about uh, using macro?
Absolutely. If you reach out, charlie@twoline.com, I'd be more than happy to do, set up some lessons that way. I don't currently have courses. Another great resource is Cornell has an online photography program. You can take individual courses or a whole, you know, uh, selection of courses that adds up to a degree of different kinds. But yeah, to get in touch, I'd love to talk more.
Great, thank you. So, what if I don't know if you can answer this question, but what are the basic settings to take a macro of an insect or a small creature during the day and have the background blacked out?
So the I would recommend um, always start at the widest open aperture that you can get. So a really small f-stop. So number. So it'd be like f1.8 or f2.8, depending on the capabilities of your lens. So that's step one. And I would usually start an aperture priority. And what that means is you're going to tell the camera, I want to shoot with my aperture really wide so that I have a really shallow depth of field. Um, and then you go ahead and do all the rest of the settings for me. It's like kind of another version of auto settings. But then from there, I would go back to uh, this button, if you can see that, the plus minus, and then I would adjust the exposure to underexpose, and I'd underexpose by one stop, take a picture. Underexpose by another stop, take a picture. And that's all I'm doing. Like that's all photography is do the same thing 100 ways and figure out which way you like it the best. Um, there are all kinds of tutorials of people being like, here's the one way to photograph, but there is no one way. But if you're trying to achieve a particular effect, such as getting the background to be black with a subject, a lot of it is lighting. Like you have that subject needs to be lit well, and then somehow the background needs to drop out. Like, and so in the case of that turtle, it was in dark water. The turtle happened to have sunlight on it, and it was a brightly colored turtle. So you could underexpose everything, and the turtle would still be properly exposed. Um, I hope I'm explaining that in a way that makes sense.
Well, we appreciate you tackling these questions, Charlie. Unfortunately, that will be the last one that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Well, thanks for tuning in today. And, I plan to do more uh, webinars on photography in the future. So if there's a particular topic you'd love covered or deep dive into something that I touched on today, feel free to shoot me an email or a message on Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.